Hello and welcome to this GCSE revision guide to an inspector calls. As normal, we're going to be looking at understanding what the play is about, AO1, and AO2, its language, its form and structure. Today's video is going to focus on Sybil Birling. As normal, we're going to look at first at the stage direction. We know from the beginning of the play that she's described as being about 50, a rather cold woman, and her husband's social superior. Priestley sets up his audience to dislike Sybil, perhaps even more than Arthur Birling. Her manner and reactions throughout the play are cold and emotionless. She acts this way towards everyone, even her own children. The stage direction, social superior, implies that Sybil may have more in common with Gerald as she's a higher class than Arthur. Her emotional detachment leave her an unfeeling character and largely immune to the lesson the inspector is trying to teach. Some notes then on Sybil Birling. We know she's superior and prejudiced towards the lower classes. She's of a different generation to Sheila and Eric and so has a different viewpoint, more on that later. She's arrogant and lacks empathy with those around her. She is remorseless and doesn't care at all what she did, as she doesn't see either as a real person. And she's ignorant and unmoving. Her position is one of the few in the play that pretty much stays the same. As normal, when looking at the characters, it's important to acknowledge whether they are a capitalist or a socialist. In this case, Sybil Birling represents the privileged and the wealthy. She is symbolic of the giant class divide that was around at this time. There was a massive difference between the rich and the poor, much more so in those days than there is now. She also represents the feeling of many of the audience, with the feelings many of the audience might have about the working class. The audience of the time would probably think very similarly to Mrs Birling. She also represents the cruel control of the class system, as the lower classes were exploited and manipulated by the wealthy, mostly for profit. At many points, Sybil is willfully blind to this happening. A grade 9 might also think about Sybil as someone who decides who is deserving and undeserving, playing God with the working class lives. She feels she's even above everyone else and can't even bring herself to say working class, using pronouns like them instead. She also manipulates her own family, sitting opposite Arthur and reprimanding him when he crosses certain social lines. As normal, if we look at the text as a biblical text, we might recognise the character's actions as linking to the 7 deadly sins. If you read Inspector Calls in this way, you'll notice that Sybil represents the sin of wrath, and perhaps pride as well. This is typically the worst sin, as it is the one that is governed by anger. Because she is driven by anger, this makes her the character the audience feel least empathy with. Let's summarise Act 1. Sybil is obsessed with etiquette and what is proper, as she guides both Arthur and Sheila on what is socially acceptable. She sees the engagement as business and something that a woman must do to support her family. She continually reprimands her family if they step out of line. Mrs Birling is absent and blind to both Mr Birling's and Sheila's confessions. Let's look in a bit more detail at some of the extracts then from Act 1. Mr Birling, noticing that his wife Sybil has not taken any drink. Now then, Sybil, you must take a little tonight. Special occasion, you know, eh? Yes, go on, Mummy. You must drink to our health. Mrs Birling, smiling. Very well then. Just a little, thank you. To Edna, who's about to go to the tray. All right, Edna. I'll ring from the drawing room where we want coffee. Probably in half an hour. Yes, Mum. Well, well, this is very nice. Very nice. Good dinner too, Sybil. Tell cook from me. Absolutely first class. Arthur, you're not supposed to say such things. Sybil, we find out from this extract, doesn't drink. She sees the world for what it is and isn't interested in happiness. building to the fact that when she sees the wedding purely as business. The word mummy used by Sheila here makes Sheila sound younger than she is, perhaps suggesting that Sheila only really connected with her mother at a young age, or that she's still treated as a small child. We see Mrs Birling saying to Edna, probably in half an hour. This seems deliberately rude and commanding to the servants. Sybil treats her own husband of the rules of social occasions, reminding us that she's a higher social rank than he is. She reminds him of the rules of engagement and rules of how to conduct himself. And in this case, she does it publicly, almost putting her husband down in front of her guest, Gerald. The tone here is similar to how she speaks to the servants. This is the opposite to the role wives had at the time, deliberately telling us she's the real power in this household. Key quotes then from Act 1. Sheila, what an impression, really, things you girls pick up these days. We then have her telling off Arthur, you're not supposed to say such things. She repeats that later on in the act. Now Arthur, I don't think you ought to talk business on occasion like this. She then reprimands Sheila once more. You'll realise that men with important work to do sometimes have to spend nearly all their time on business. Notice all 4 quotes together remind us of what role she has in the house and how she's the driving force. She's the teacher in the room. She's the one telling the other characters how to conduct themselves. A grade 9 might notice that Sybil sees the wedding as business that a woman must endure. It is expected that Gerald will have affairs and be away on business, whilst the woman stays at home. She views this as a woman's duty, but once married, it may be Sybil's view that that is when a woman can begin to assert influence by controlling her husband. I suppose she's a bit like Lady Macbeth in that way. Lady Macbeth is the real power and then manipulates her husband to get what she wants. Mrs Birling perhaps is very similar. Let's look a bit at the context then of Mrs Birling. Why is she behaving the way she does? You can see on the top right there an excerpt from the play that demonstrates some of the things I'm about to say. Mrs Birling looks down on the middle and working class. This is how she was brought up by her own parents. She is rude and assertive to those she thinks are below her. So that's everyone apart from Gerald in the play.
Sir Arthur is, of course, president of the World Domination League. Sir Arthur, I wonder if I could begin by asking you whether you...
No, certainly not. Certainly not. I dislike the whole tone of the question and the aggressive way it was phrased.
I'm sorry, I haven't really begun yet.
You haven't really begun. You've begun quite far enough for me, thank you. You can't bully and hit me, you know, like a lot of other people you've tried to do it to. No, thank you very much. Rephrase the question immediately. Come along, rephrase it. That was no good at all.
Well, I'll try again. Sir Arthur, I wonder...
That's no better. The same manner, the same tone of voice, the same sort of sneering undertones in your voice.
Not at all. I wasn't being at all impolite.
I think we've gone into this question quite deeply enough. I've answered it fully. You've been very aggressive. You've bullied me, and you've been extraordinarily rude, and I ask you to apologise.
Well, if you've been offended, then I apologise.
Thank God for that. Is that a camera?
Yes, it is.
Is that a camera? A horrible little red light on it? Will you get the film out of that camera and give it to me at once?
No, there's no film in the camera, sir.
Are you refusing to give me the film out of that camera?
No, of course I'm not.
I realise what you people do with those films. You edit them, you cut them about, you change them round so that decent people, decent political figures such as myself, become ridiculous. I am leaving here now. I have friends in influential places and you won't be sitting on this seat tomorrow. You'll have another job. No, rather you won't have any job at all.
Sir
Miles, right? Sir Miles, darling, where are you?
We did have Sir Arthur, JB Priestley, in the studio tonight. But he declined to appear.
Are you continuing with this ridiculous performance? I told you to stop the film. Stop all those people cranking round the film.
I'm just rehearsing for tomorrow night.
You're rehearsing for tomorrow night. You won't be here tomorrow night. Let me tell you that much.
That was Dudley Moore and Peter Cook with their contribution for the 1000th TDT. They're in Melbourne where their new show Behind the Fridge opens tomorrow night.
Mrs Birling is all about legacy. She is aware of her limitations as a rich upper-class woman, but works hard to build power within those boundaries. She fights viciously to maintain the power and has the power she has against all aggressors. She exploits what she can to achieve this: her class, her sex, her position in the family. Mrs Birling was taught the rules of being a woman at a very young age. Her whole upbringing would be about being acceptable to a man and what is suitable in a marriage.
Middle-class girls needed a new kind of education for the new kind of life that they were leading. Once ideas about middle-class gentility start to take hold from the turn of the 19th century onwards, clearly girls are leading a different kind of life. They are not helping their mothers with the housework, they don't have servants to do that. Their father's business will be several miles away from the home, so they're not going to be helping there. They're at home all day. They need a new set of skills to prepare them for the life ahead. The sole aim, really, for a middle-class woman now is to get married to a man, hopefully one who is solvent, who's healthy, and who her parents approve of. So she's got to make herself attractive. And that means learning particular kinds of accomplishments, the kind of accomplishments that upper-class girls have always been taught, but now middle-class girls are being taught too. Typically, it's learning conversational French. It's learning how to play the piano. Some dancing might be involved. There's also more subtle things. She's going to go into a world where she has to learn how to behave and how to manage her physical presence. How to stand upright, not slouch. How close do you stand to other people? What happens when you need to be excused when you need the bathroom? How do you ask for that? As always with anything to do with the Victorians, it wasn't quite as simple as it seemed. So middle-class girls were certainly supposed to be educated in the sense that they were supposed to read to expand their minds, but woe betide if they became blue stockings. That was the worst thing. Now, a blue stocking is a young woman who simply knows too much stuff, who reads too widely, who cares too much about what she reads, who starts to sort of take over the kind of role that's expected of a young man in the sense of she wants to argue about politics at dinner. She suddenly wants to start reading the classics in the original languages, Latin, Greek, and heaven forbid even Hebrew. That's the kind of girl, as far as middle-class Victorians are concerned, that no sensible man is going to want to marry. She's made herself masculine. Some doctors believe that quite literally the more a girl read, the more masculine her appearance. She would start to look hollow-cheeked. Something very unpleasant would happen to her ovaries. She would start to become a kind of desiccated spinster. So the emphasis was on learning, but not too much learning, of being able to speak to anybody in a kind of interesting and lively way, but to never touch too deeply on serious subjects.
You may wonder why Mrs Birling, with her high-class background, would be married to Mr Birling. And the clue may be that she's very masculine and confrontational in her outlook. It isn't her class that the audience at the time would dislike her for. It is the way she dominates the room. That would make her a daunting prospect for any husband-to-be. She knows this, which may be why she warned Sheila to fulfil her role as a woman. As the other characters develop, Sybil remains cold and unaffected. The audience witness the other characters begin to reflect on their actions. The more they're interrogated, the more they seem to really think about what they're doing. Sybil, however, is still heartless. She's been sent out the room by the middle of the play, or left the room by the middle of the play, so you may think she hasn't heard, but it is more likely she sees these working class girls' problems as beneath her and simply doesn't want to listen to them. Priestley often removes Sybil from the room whilst the others confess. This suggests a metaphorical blindness that Sybil feels towards the way the working class are treated. It adds to her disconnection to her children as she further distances herself from what the young are going through. Some key aspects then of Act 2. Mrs Birling enters and is unaware of what's happened. She is still happy and at ease. Mrs Birling is rude and harsh to the inspector and Sheila. She doesn't defend her daughter as Gerald tells of his experiences of the women of the town. Then she tells of her experiences with Mrs Birling and Daisy Renton. She blames the father of the child for Eva's death. Then she realises she's talking about Eric. Some grade 9 answers then for Sybil Birling. Some things that might be considered a bit more original or a bit more high level than what I've said so far. Sybil is a terrible mother, frequently using abrupt language to describe her own children. This child rather than my daughter. Both parents tend to try and send their 20-plus-year-old children to bed. Priestley often ridicules Sybil as she appears more annoyed at the way Alderman Meggerty is described to Gerald. He is described as perhaps a carcass, rather than the way her daughter was treated by Gerald. She reminds her then, and there's no need to be disgusting. Yet again then she's ridiculing and reprimanding other characters. Let's join Sybil as she begins talking about her involvement then with Eva Smith or Daisy Renton.
You remember that Mr. Croft told us, quite truthfully, I believe, that he hadn't spoken to or seen Eva Smith since last September. Well, Mrs. Birling spoke to and saw her only 2 weeks ago.
Mother!
Is this true?
Yes, it's quite true.
She applied to your committee for help, didn't she?
Yes.
Not as Eva Smith.
No. Nor as Daisy Renton.
As what then?
First, she called herself Mrs. Birling.
Mrs Birling?
Oh, it's quite simply a piece of gross impertinence, quite deliberate. And naturally, it was one of the things that prejudiced me against her
I
case.
should think so too. Damned impudence.
You admit to being prejudiced against the case?
Yes.
Mother, she's just died a horrible death, don't forget.
I am very sorry. But I think she had only herself to blame.
Was it owing to your influence, as the most prominent member of the committee, that help was refused to this girl?
Possibly.
Was it, or was it not your influence?
Yes, it was. I didn't like her manner. She'd impertinently made use of our name, though she pretended afterwards it just happened to be the first she thought of. She had to admit, after I began questioning her, that she had no claim to the name, that she wasn't married, and that the story she told at first about her husband who deserted her was quite false. It didn't take me long to get the truth, or some of the truth, out of her.
Why did she want help?
You know very well why she wanted help.
No, I don't. I know why she needed help, but as I wasn't there, I don't know what she asked of your committee.
I don't think we need discuss it.
You have no hope of not discussing it, Mrs. Birling.
If you think you can bring any pressure to bear upon me, Inspector, you're quite mistaken. The girl asked for assistance. I wasn't satisfied with her claim, so I used my influence to have it refused. I have done nothing wrong, and you know it.
I think you've done something terribly wrong, and that you're going to spend the rest of your life regretting it. Just remember, this girl was going to have a child.
Oh no. Horrible. Horrible. How could she have wanted to kill herself?
She'd been turned down and turned out too many times. This was the end.
Mother, you must have known.
It was because she was going to have a child that she asked for assistance from your mother's committee.
Now, look here. This wasn't Gerald Croft.
No, nothing to do with him.
Thank goodness for that. But I don't know why I should care.
And you've nothing else to tell me?
Yes. I'll tell you what I told her. Go and look for the father of the child. It's his responsibility.
That doesn't make it any the less yours. She came to you for help when no woman could have needed it more. And you not only refused it yourself, but you saw to it that the others refused it too. She not only needed money, but she needed advice, help, sympathy, understanding. Well, you've had children, you must have known what she was feeling, and you slammed the door in her face.
Mother, I think it was cruel and vile.
I must say, Sybil, when this comes out at the inquest, it isn't going to look too good for us. I mean, the press might easily take it
Stop
up.
it, both of you. In the circumstances, I think I was perfectly justified. The girl had begun by telling a pack of lies. Afterwards, when I got at the truth, I discovered she knew who the father was. She was quite certain about that. So I told her it was her business to make him responsible.
And what did she reply to that?
Oh, a lot of silly nonsense.
What was it?
Whatever it was, I know it made me finally lose all patience with her. She was giving herself ridiculous airs. She was claiming elaborate fine feelings that were simply absurd for a girl in that position.
Her position now is that she lies with a burnt-out inside on a slab.
Oh, that's quite
Now, don't
unnecessary.
stammer and yammer at me, man. I'm losing all patience with you people. What did she say?
She said the father was only a youngster. There couldn't be any question of marrying him. It would be wrong for them both. He had given her money, but she wasn't going to take any more money from him.
Why wasn't she going to take any more money?
A lot of silly nonsense. I didn't believe a word of it.
I warn you, you're making it worse for yourself. Now, what reason did she give for not wanting to take any more money?
Her story was, he'd said something one night, he was drunk of course, that gave her the idea that it wasn't his money. At least that's the story she finally told me. After I refused to believe her original story, and I didn't see any reason to believe that one story should be any truer than the other.
But if her story was true, and that the boy was stealing money, then she came to you for help, to keep this youngster out of any more trouble, isn't that so?
Possibly. But it sounded ridiculous to me, so I was perfectly justified in advising my committee not to allow her claim for assistance.
And you're not sorry now when you know what happened to the girl?
I am sorry she came to such a horrible end, but I accept no blame for it at all.
Who is to blame then?
Well, first the girl herself.
Her father and me had her chucked out of her job.
Secondly, I blame the father of the child she was going to have.
But if her story was true, and he was stealing money...
But there is no point in assuming that.
But if we do? Now what then?
Oh, then he'd be entirely responsible. Because the girl would never have come to us and have been refused assistance if it hadn't been for him.
So he's the chief culprit anyhow?
Certainly. And he ought to be dealt with very severely.
Mother, stop!
Be quiet, Sheila.
But don't you see?
Oh, you are behaving like a hysterical child tonight.
And if you would take some steps to find this young man,
And see to it that he's compelled to confess in public his responsibility instead of staying here asking quite unnecessary questions, then you really would be doing your duty.
Don't worry, Mrs. Birling. I shall do my duty.
Oh, I am glad to hear it. And now perhaps you'd like to say good night.
Not yet. I'm waiting.
Waiting for what?
To do my duty.
now, Mother, don't you see?
Mrs. Birling there, realising quite who might be to blame. Let's look closer at the language she used there. Mrs. Birling, a lot of nonsense, didn't believe a word of it. I'm not asking if you believed it. I want to know what she said. Why didn't she take any more money from this boy? Oh, she had some fancy reason, as if a girl was of that sort could ever refuse money. I warn you, you're making it worse for yourself. What reason did she have for not taking any more money? Her story was that he'd said something one night when she was drunk that gave her the idea it wasn't his money. Where did he get it from then? He'd stolen it. So she'd come to you for assistance because she didn't want to take any stolen money. That's the story she finally told after I'd refused to believe her original story. That was that she was a married woman who'd been deserted by her husband. I didn't see any reason to believe that one story would be any truer than the other. Therefore, you're quite wrong. I suppose I shall regret what I did. Mrs. Birling's tone here is repeatedly defiant. She is speaking in statements, firm in her conviction that she's in the right. Both the Inspector and Mrs. Birling are clashing here as both seek dominance in the conversation, but the Inspector is clearly in the right, so Mrs. Birling comes across as arrogant and defiant, and perhaps a little bit foolish. When she pauses here with the dash, her story was that he'd said something one night. Perhaps Miss Birling is now reflecting on her words, implying a sense of cunning and guile. Perhaps she's now editing the story to make herself look better. Mrs. Birling clearly thinks of Eva as a child who wants attention. She is naive and condescending to Eva, and when she refuses to admit that Eva's even a human being and the problems she faces are real. This shows then Mrs. Birling is emotionally detached. Let's now look at the end of the act. Mrs. Birling, but surely, I mean, it's ridiculous. Look, Inspector, you're not trying to tell us that my boy is mixed up in this? If he is, we know what to do, don't we? Mrs Birling has just told us. My God, but look here. I don't believe it. I won't believe it. Mother, I begged and begged you to stop. We then have the curtain falling slowly as we're left thinking about Mrs Birling, her actions, and what may happen next. Mrs Birling's sentence structure here has changed and fractured as her truth begins to break apart as she finally begins to see reality. We're used to Mrs Birling being assured, confident, and talking in short, sharp sentences. By breaking down her sentence structure, it shows that her version of the truth is also breaking down. The stage direction finally reveals her a brief moment of weakness in Mrs Birling as she shares with her husband. She stops. It is the first time that her conceited, aloof attitude has been broken by the inspector. When she repeats, "I don't believe it, I won't believe it," perhaps this is the first time we may empathise with Mrs Birling. Her position of authority is gone, and she's forced to sit under the weight of her responsibility. The repetition here is almost for herself, as if she's finally reflecting and processing what happened. The characters of Sheila and Sybil are contrasted here, as Sheila's language changes to the more formal mother, as she now assumes the position of power her mother once held. Gone are the simplistic words such as mummy. Key quotes then that Mrs Birling uses in reference to Eva Smith. Each time, notice she's been negative and she's distancing herself from the situation. She's emotionally detached. She sees this as just an episode that happened that she'd almost completely forgotten about. The most interesting quote perhaps is the last one, as if a girl of that sort would refuse money. The nastiness of that sort implies Mrs Birling's deep-seated hatred of the lower classes. She doesn't see them as people, she's objectifying them, sees them just as objects to be controlled. What is the writer's purpose here then? Well, Priestley was disillusioned with capitalism and believed it was the cause of suffering and devastation in Britain. He thinks the rise of capitalism was due to the wealthy class who had power or control over Britain before the First World War. He thought that the way the British hierarchy controlled the way Britain was run was out of date and doesn't connect with people who live in 1912 or even 1945. He uses Sybil just to show just how out of touch the upper classes were. In summary, Sybil is responsible for the suicide because she refused to help Eva Smith when she was in need. Rather than empathise with Eva, Mrs Birling chooses to interrogate Eva rather than listen to her. She makes Eva feel she's a bad person as she's pregnant and single. She was deliberately rude and elitist to Eva to make her feel worse and inhuman. She uses her influence in the Bromley Women's Charity Organisation to persuade the rest of the committee not to give her money. A summary of Act 3. Mrs Birling realised she doesn't know her son Eric as he recounts his experience with Eva. Mrs Birling leaves as she can't hear any more, but returns soon afterwards. Mrs Birling claims to be the first to wonder about the inspector. She becomes sure of herself that she did the right thing. She believes that, as the inspector was fake, it doesn't matter. She is grateful to Gerald for finding out that there wasn't a suicide. And she denies, once more, all responsibility. Let's look a bit closer then at some of the extracts from Act 3. Eric, I can't believe it. There must be some mistake. You don't know what we've been saying. It's a good job for him he doesn't, isn't it? Why? Because Mother's been busy blaming everything on the young man who got this girl into trouble and saying he shouldn't escape and should be made an example of. That's enough, Sheila. You haven't made it any easier for me, have you, Mother? But I didn't know it was you. I never dreamt. Besides, you're not that type. You don't get drunk. Of course he does. I told you he did. Priestley continues to suggest to us the deterioration of Mrs Birling as she repeats the lines from the end of Act 2. She uses the collective pronoun we as she attempts to move the blame from herself to the group. Gerald copies this same technique later. Priestley deliberately suggests the reversal of power through the number of lines Sheila and Mrs Birling have to say. Sheila now says a lot more than Mrs Birling does. Mrs Birling is now not the most powerful person in this room. The simplistic language here echoes the fragile state of Miss Birling's world at this point as she tries to recollect the evening's events and is cut off by her own daughter. Priestley uses the lack of sentence cohesion and low-level syntax to challenge us to see Mrs Birling as weak. This is in direct contrast to the rest of the play, and is also the longest she's now been on stage. She is forced to bear witness to her crimes, both against Eva and her own family. This moment is brief, as the upper class may have reflected after World War I, but soon attempted to regain the status quo soon afterwards. Let's watch then as Mrs Birling begins to unravel and realises what's happened.
As Gerald says, we've been had.
I've felt it all the time. He never talked like one. He never even looked like one.
Oh, this makes a difference, you know. In fact, it makes all the difference. Well, of course.
I suppose we're all nice people now.
Oh, if you've nothing more sensible to say, Sheila, you'd better keep quiet.
She's right, though.
And you keep quiet, too. If that man had been a police inspector and you had confessed...
Careful.
Oh, yes, yes.
You see, Gerald, you happen to know the rest of our crimes and idiocies.
Well, that's all right. I don't want to. What do you make of this business now? Was it a hoax?
Oh, of course. Somebody put that fellow up to coming up here and hoaxing us. Well, there are people in this town who dislike me enough to do that. We should have seen through him in the first place.
I wish I'd been here when he first arrived. I'd have asked him a few questions before I allowed him to ask us any.
It's all right saying that now.
I was the only one of you who didn't give in to him. And now I say we must discuss this business quietly and sensibly and decide if there's anything to be done about it.
Yup.
You can see then after watching that Mrs Birling's fragility when she realises her own son might be to blame quickly disappears. By the end of the play, she's just as assertive, direct and rude as she's always been. Sybil Birling, grade 9. When she says, "Eric, you stole money," after she realises that Eric had been stealing money to fund Eva, Sybil is even more shocked that Eric stole a small amount of money, then used prostitutes and got Eva pregnant. Again, willfully blind with the way women and the lower class are treated, as this is how she expects them to be treated. The inspector blames Mrs Birling the most, repeating, "Remember what you did." Her silence is telling, as she does not repent. She's hated by the audience, as she is unmotherly towards her children and her grandchild. The audience at the time would have been mostly rich and female, as most of the men were still fighting the war when the play was first on stage in 1945. It is this element of her that they would find most shocking, the fact she is not a good mother and treats her own children in the way she does. Key quotes from her then in Act 3. You can see there the massive change between the fractured sentence structure in "Oh, Eric, how could you?" and then returning to her normal statements that she used at the beginning of the play from the moment she realises the inspector was potentially fake. In fact, the stage direction triumphantly over on the left-hand side there suggests she actually deems this as a victory over the working class. So, the audience reactions in 1945. What would they really think of Mrs Birling? Priestley goes out of her way to make us dislike Sybil Birling. She is aloof and unkind throughout, offering little, if any, empathy to Eva or anyone else. This would have been the type of upper-class lady the audience would be familiar with. Because of the nature of the play, the audience would have been female and most likely middle-class ladies. Mrs Birling embodies the worst of capitalism and is clearly in the wrong. By contrasting her to the inspector's socialist message so clearly, Priestley hoped to convince the similar audience in the theatre to change their own ways, and perhaps attitudes. The keynotes, then, for Mrs Birling. The sentence starters of possible paragraphs are at the top, and as you'll see underneath, you'll see quotes appear, and then how you'd write about those quotes in the exam. From the start of the play, Mrs Birling is a capitalist, interested chiefly in status and wealth. She illustrates an upper-class woman's place in society at this time. And there you can see the quotes and explanations for the beginning of the play. As the play develops, Mrs Birling believes her social status places her above the law and grows increasingly hostile towards the inspector. She shows no compassion towards the news of Eva Smith's death and would rather the whole business be done away with. There you can see 3 key quotes from the middle of the play. By the play's conclusion, Mrs Birling is finally revealed to be just as guilty as everyone else. She used her position with the local women's charity board to punish Eva rather than help her along with her husband. And by the end of the play, Mrs Birling has learned nothing and is unrepentant. Now in the video we're going to move on to exam essay guidance. Once more I'll remind you this is a morality play. It is trying to teach us the message of socialism, so we'd expect lots of references to Priestley and what Priestley is trying to do in our response. None of the characters are real. They are constructs built to represent different parts of society. It would be a fatal flaw in your answer to consider them as real people and say what the people are doing rather than what Priestley is making the people do. Once more, we're going to look at an extract. In the exam, you'll be given 1 page of the book to work from, or 1 page of the play to work from. And it's always a good idea to look at exactly where this extract comes from, the key quotes being used and how you might explain them, the sentence types, tone of voice, and of course how the characters respond to each other is just as important as what the characters actually say. Now we're going to listen to how this particular extract would be performed.
I was upset because Eric had left the house, and this man said that if Eric didn't come back, he'd have to go and find him. Well, that made me feel worse still. And his manner was so severe, and he seemed so confident. Then quite suddenly he said I'd seen Eva Smith only 2 weeks ago.
Those were his exact words.
And like a fool I said I had.
I don't see now why you did that. She didn't call herself Eva Smith when she came to see you at the committee, did she?
Of course she didn't. But when he suddenly turned on me with those questions, I answered more or less as he wanted.
Now we've heard it, which gives us an idea of her tone of voice and how she's interacting with Mr Birling. We now look at the marking criteria to see exactly how this might be applied. On the left-hand side is AO1, which is where I need to explore the meanings behind the words. Ideally, for the highest grades, I'd use a sensitive and evaluative approach. I want to get under the surface of the words. I want to think exactly why she's saying what she is, what's motivating her, or perhaps more importantly, why Priestley is making her say what she does. On the other side, I've got AO2. Okay, this is where I analyse the language, its form and its structure. Precise subject terminology would be needed for the highest grades. I need to identify those short, sharp sentences. I need to look at how much description is being used. If similes are being used, I need to comment on that. And equally, if repetition is being used, I want to comment on that as well. So, we've heard the extract, we know what tone of voice is being used, we've studied the mark scheme to get an idea of roughly what you'd need to write. I now need to think, well, this scene comes from the end of the play, and I know at this point Mrs Birling is calming down but still shaken. Her tone is brittle but still logical as she begins to put together the pieces and work out why she's still in the right. You're just about to see my full written response to this extract. I've colour-coded this, as you can see, word choices in red, sentence types in green, tone of voice in yellow, characters' response to each other in purple, where the play it comes from, or my reference to where in the play it comes from is in grey, and whether the characters are acting in a way you'd expect is in blue. It's important to think if the characters are staying true to form, if they're behaving in a way we'd expect, or has something shaken them to make them react in a way that's perhaps different to every other part of the play. Here's my response then. Simplistically, by the play's conclusion, Sybil hasn't changed and offers us a much more complex character than the other Birlings. However, Priestley gives us stage direction that says she's shaken by what happens as she is seated, usually in a position of less or lower power. However, she once more refers to the lower classes by gender rather than name as she attempts to regain control she's lost, referring to the inspector simply as the man. This is one of the few points in the play where she shows some weakness. Like a fool, I said yes. The reason she may feel stupid is because she's been outwitted by the lower classes, not because of what she did to Eva. Her tone here is softer and calmer than we've come to appreciate from the character, yet her use of statements rather than questions suggests the cold Mrs Birling is still very much with us. Cold, remember, is part of the stage direction at the start. Mrs Birling uses the word fool to describe her actions, and Priestley allows us to glimpse the fact that she's internalised her struggle to comprehend her actions rather than fully empathise with the pain her son or daughter are going through. When Mr Birling responds, he capitalises on this weakness and chastises her for this admission. He too is wanting to regain control of his household. It's like a power play between Mr and Mrs Birling. They both know they've got weaknesses to cover up, and they're fighting it out verbally to see who's going to maintain control or maintain power. Now, if you looked at this answer, you notice I frequently link to the reader with words like us or we. The word Priestley, linking to the writer, is there frequently, as I want the examiner to appreciate that I understand Priestley has created this. He's the one who actually made them act this way. It's not because Mrs Birling is a bad person, it's because Priestley wants us to see her as a bad person. Now we're going to move on to one of the harder questions you could be asked in the exam. How is the theme of love presented in the play? Now, different characters exhibit love in different ways, and equally we know that actually quite a few characters are deliberately not showing love for each other or love for Eva Smith. Indeed, we've got then characters we can talk about, the engagement at the beginning, but a lot of my answer is going to be focused on a lack of love. We'd expect, for example, Mrs Birling to love her daughter, but she rarely shows it, and that's what I'd explore in this answer or this response. This is then a brief essay plan for this topic. These might be the beginnings of each paragraph I might write. So I have bullet point number 1, where Priestley explores the nature of love and marriage from the perspectives of different characters, and in some cases their understanding of love changes. Birling sees marriage as a way of climbing the social ladder. Mr Birling's motives for marrying Sybil Birling may have more to do with her social position. Parental love is lacking in Eric's life. He complains that neither his parents are kind and would seek help from him if he was in trouble. Physical attraction rather than love is one motive behind Gerald and also Eric's relationship with Daisy Renton. Inspector Gall promotes love as a charity. Inspector Gall is here showing then love for his fellow man rather than love between individuals. If I was to take each one of these answers and the page references here linked to our copy of the play, I'd be able to write a full essay exploring different characters' motivations with evidence from each one. It might be a really good exam practice to take these beginning sentences away and actually write the rest of the paragraph. This video is not, in this case, going to give you a full answer, but more of a starting point for where you might explore this theme in more depth. Mr. and Mrs. Birling. Whether or not Mr. and Mrs. Birling objected to her husband, whether or not Mrs. Birling objected to her husband spending so much time on his business, she comments that when Sheila marries Gerald, that she'll have to get used to it. Married women during the Edwardian period, as some from whatever class they came, would be expected to put their husbands before themselves at all times. While Mr. and Mrs. Birling have marriage in which they share and support each other's opinions, Mrs. Birling notes that men with important work to do, such as her husband, spend nearly all their time and energy on their business. This suggests the marriage then lacks affection. They're more business partners than they are soulmates. These then give you some ideas that you might cover in your response. The inspector preaches a form of love, a sort of true charity, which is a deep care for our fellow human beings. This is quite alien to Mrs. Birling, who's prepared to devote time to charity while actually having no real care for other people. The inspector says, near the end of the play, and this might be seen as the main message of the play, that one Eva Smith has gone, but there are millions and millions and millions of Eva Smiths and John Smiths still left with us. We don't live alone. We are members of one body. We are responsible for each other. If I was looking at that particular quote and thinking what I'd say about it linked to the theme of love, I might notice the repetition of millions. I might look at the inclusion of Eva Smith and John Smith there, and the word us and we that he uses. He was hoping the Birlings unite to look at all the lower class people around them and think actually we could treat them better. He's hoping to inspire love in their fellow man in each of the Birlings. That perhaps is why he picks them off one by one, hoping to teach them so they can unite together at the end with a common purpose, to change their ways and help their fellow man. Of course, we know the inspector fails in this. By the end of the play, all the characters really are reacting more to the fact he wasn't real and less to the fact of what they've done to Eva Smith. That is then why he has to knock a second time to repeat the lesson he tried to teach them. Thank you then for listening to this revision guide for Sybil Birling, which is your GCSE post-1914 drama.